Walking over from the Center of Design Thinking over into Whitley Auditorium. Hopefully you got a nice little view of that piece of campus. It is an absolutely gorgeous day, as you see, so hopefully you got to enjoy that. I'm Tracy Thurnis. I'm Associate Professor in the Physician Assistant Studies Department and a Faculty Catalyst with the Center for Design Thinking. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our closing keynote session today. We hope it's going to be a thought-provoking conversation that promises to challenge our perspectives and inspire new ways of thinking about life beyond the human. I recognize many faces here who were participants in our book club, so I'm really happy to have those participants join us today. Today, we're honored to host the brilliant authors of Relationality and Emergent Politics of Life Beyond the Human. And they didn't write that, we wrote that. Arturo Escobar, you all rave as I say your name so they recognize who we are, great. Michal Osterweil and Kriti Sharma. Three scholars whose work has reshaped how we understand interconnectedness, social movements, and the possibilities for transformation in our world. I'm just going to provide you a quick bio of all three of our authors, and then we'll turn the session over to them. So Arturo Escobar is a professor of anthropology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His work explores political ecology, ontological design, and anthropology of globalization, social movements, and technoscience. And for a PA, that is a lot of words, I will just say. He is the author of Designs for the Pluriverse and actively engages in transition design projects in Colombia, working toward more just and sustainable futures. Arturo, thank you for joining us today. Michal Osterweil is an associate professor at UNC Chapel Hill and a radical homemaker and community actionist. Her scholarship focuses on social movements, new imaginaries of social change, and the intersection of knowledge production, epistemology, and change work. Her research challenges us to rethink how we conceptualize activism and transformation. Michal, thanks for joining us. And last but not least, Kriti Sharma is an assistant professor of critical race science and technology studies at the California Institute of Technology. So I think she traveled the farthest.
Okay. She's not Santa Cruz.
Yeah, University. Santa Cruz?
Yes,
okay,
right.
Santa Cruz. So she still traveled the farthest. With a background in microbiology, ecology, and philosophy, she's the author of Interdependence, Biology, and Beyond. Her work examines microbiology, the philosophy of science, and the metaphysics of life. Kriti, thanks for joining us today. Together, our panelists bring a wealth of knowledge and diverse perspectives, weaving together insights from anthropology, social movements, ecology, and philosophy. They will share compelling stories and transformative strategies from their life's work today. Following their discussion, we will open the floor for an engaging Q&A session, welcoming questions from both our virtual and our in-person audiences. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Arturo, Michal, and Kriti.
I'm going to stand first, and I'll probably end up sitting, but I'm going to invite you. We're going to get grounded first, which is important to us. So if you would, find your feet like flat on the floor if you can. I should have brought a chair out here. So we're going to actually take a moment and find our feet and our sits bones, to be polite, or your butt, in the chair. And really just take a moment and feel, thank you, perfect. Feel yourself arrive. And I'm going to put a little bit of music on, and we're going to just get grounded. We tried the sound, it should work. So feel the weight in your feet. You can even lean forward for a minute, and then feel the weight in your butt. Just take a couple of breaths. Exhale is as long, if not longer, than your inhale. Make sure you feel the lower part of your body, and if you feel comfortable, it's helpful to close your eyes, or at least let them just kind of glaze over. Tell your vigilance to just take a back seat for a moment. just check in, what's here right now? I know for me lately, when I do this, the first thing I feel is the grief. And Eugene started us off so beautifully by inviting joy in. And I want us to get to joy. But I think that one cannot be alive on this planet right now and not feel some grief. And one of our teachers, Joanna Macy, has a practice where you breathe it in. You stop tensing and fighting it. You actually invite it in, but always holding something that you're grateful for, like a photo, kind of like a snapshot in your back pocket, because you don't want to get derailed by it. So I'm just going to invite you to gently breathe it in. Let your heart feel what it feels. And you can do this as a practice. And if you're afraid that your heart might break, something that I always remember from Joanna Macy is that the heart that breaks open can hold the whole universe. I was born on a land that is currently at war, and the people that are supposedly my people are the oppressors, bringing the violence right now. And I feel deeply, deeply sad. And I want to feel that and also send them my love and my joy. And in Buddhism, there is a practice where you breathe in pain and you send out love. You send out joy, because we have that capacity here in this beautiful spring day. One of the fascinating things about interdependence or relationality, as we'll continue to talk about, is in order for you to feel joy, you also have to feel grief. We can't just have one. And so much of our culture wants to just find the joy, but our hearts are stealing away, like they're just holding so much back because of how much pain is just around. So I just want to invite you to practice letting it in. But then don't hold on to it. Breathe it back out into the web of life that resources all of us. The Zapatistas, who were a really major source of influence for us, one of the books we discovered actually as we were writing this book, we hadn't read it before, talk about how it was only when their hearts experienced like the spilling over of the amount of sadness that they found their collective heart. And were able to create one of the movements that has inspired millions around the world to not try to change this world, but to build other ones. As you feel ready, you can slowly start moving your toes, maybe wiggling your fingers, maybe touching your chest, your heart, reminding yourself that you're here. The heart is, right, like getting a hug or giving yourself this actually releases oxytocin. It's not just like symbolic. So if you're needing that after that moment of tenderness, and hey, like tears are welcome, because all is welcome in this story of life that we would like to talk about now. So before each of us talks a little bit about our process, which is what we were asked to do, we wanted to start with a poem, the one that starts our book. We just wanted to read it and bring those words into this space. Also acknowledging that Sylvia Winter, who was another one of our inspirers, not sure which the word is, and she quotes Césaire, who writes, "Poetic knowledge is born in the great silence of scientific knowledge." And while we are quote unquote social scientists, so that's how they categorize us, we found so much medicine in poetry, and that's sort of where we turn to. And sometimes when my students are like, "I don't understand your book," I'm like, just treat it like poetry. So, I mean, I'm giving ourselves more credit, but she's the poet, she really is. So, Kriti.
Thank you. Oh, thank you for that lovely meditation, Michal. It really helped. Thank you. This is a poem called "On Another Panel About Climate. They Ask Me to Sell the Future, and All I've Got is a Love Poem," by Aisha Siddiqa. What if the future is soft and revolution is so kind that there is no end to us in sight? Whole cities breathe and bad luck is bested by a promise to the leaves. To withstand your own end is difficult. The future frolics about, promise to no one, as is her right. Rage against injustice makes the voice grow harsher yet. If the future leaves without us, the silence that will follow will be an unspeakable nothing. What if we convince her to stay? How rare and beautiful it is that we exist. What if we stun existence one more time? When I wake up, get out of bed, my 7-year-old cousin with her ruptured belly tags along. Then follows my grandmother, aunts, my other cousins, and the violent shape of their drinking water. The earth remembers everything. Our bodies are the color of the earth, and we are nobodies. Being born from so many apocalypses, what's one more? Love is still the only revenge. It grows each time the earth is set on fire. But for what it's worth, I'd do this again. Gamble on humanity 100 times over, commit to life unto life as the trees fall and take us with them. I'd follow love into extinction.
Yeah, so that poem really encapsulates that fullness of life. Like, we're not giving up on the world, but we have to acknowledge where we are, right? We have to remember where we've been, and we can't, ironically, keep trying to go towards the future without reconciling with our past. So I have the honor of talking a little bit about our collective process, because they asked us to bring our individual stories, and one of the things that really characterizes this book was that it was collective. And I think this is the only book I've ever successfully published, and I actually have come to a decision that I only want to write collectively. This was one of the most phenomenal processes that I've had the privilege to be a part of in my life, and I want to say that I adore these two people and feel like there were points in the middle of the book, because we started imagining the book in 2019, but then we didn't really start getting writing. You know, you think about 2019, then something really big happened, and so we didn't really get into the writing until spring of 2020, and you know, a lot was going on in the world right then, and there was a point at which it wasn't clear, but I realized that it didn't matter to me if the book ever happened, like actually came out, because the process, like these two people, I think we met every week or every other week, and we just could process the world and make sense of it, not in the way that the dominant media was doing. Materially, so like more concretely, The process actually arose because in 2011, Arturo and I, who were both teaching at UNC Chapel Hill, started a project or a seminar, and we have this Carolina Seminars, which is like meant to be for community and and faculty and students, and it was called The Theory and Politics of Relationality. So that was very cool.
They're short. They don't.
Yeah, no, I love it. That was a shout out to so the first meeting, we like put out a call and like 45 people show up in this really small room in Alumni Hall, which was where we taught. And one of those people was Kriti, who we had known years earlier, but hadn't seen in quite a long time. And so it started sort of from that moment of trying to name this thing called relationality. But before that, both Arturo and I had been part of what was called the Social Movement Working Group. And we had, beginning in 2003, so I was a graduate student in the Department of Anthropology where Arturo was teaching, and there was an amazing group of just like interdisciplinary scholars from graduate programs and different professors from all over the university, and we started to meet. And one of the things that united us was this idea that the social movements we were studying were not objects to be studied, but rather interlocutors or actually theorizers of new worlds, of better possibilities, of better futures. And we really advocated for them as best we could in the academic lexicon as knowledge and theory producers. And we did actually successfully write in one journal because other ones didn't really like that argument. We did that social movement working group for like 8 years. And then in 2011, for a lot of different reasons, and I think Arturo really is the person that brought the concept of relationality to me, and hopefully he'll remind us why that word came out. But the process for me that I'll talk about individually, but I think what we were coming upon as a group intellectually was that we were both coming against the limits of a lexicon of social change and of a way of studying social change and the actors who do it, so the limits of what we could describe, but then the encounter with this other way, right? This other way of being that was so much more inclusive and didn't fit the parameters of the political that we had been trained in, or the social scientific, or really the theoretical, right? And so we were really like caught by this because it was very magical or even mystical for me when I started. And I always laugh because there was one time I remember in the social movement working group where one of the students was like, we were getting really excited about a set of ideas, and one student was like, whoa, 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 whoa. Does anyone else feel like you need to be like in an altered state? Like they used a different word, like to smoke something if they want to join us. But we were like, so that's where we kind of were going. And so in 2011, Arturo and I began teaching a course, Social Change in Times of Crisis, Knowledge, Action, and Ontology. And part of what we were trying to get at with that word ontology, which we will discuss a lot more, is that what's at stake here is not simply like fixing or finding a political solution within the world that we know, but rather remaking the world or making new worlds, right? And also recognizing that there are millions of people that are not in the dominant worldview, quote unquote, even though they're probably the majority, that already work and like inhabit these, what we would now start to call the relational life worlds, right? Still connected to the understanding of us as relational beings and of humans and non-humans as part of an interconnected web of life. So we had talked a long time about wanting to put out a book, and interestingly, when we started talking about it, we really were thinking of just a book about like the sources of this way of thinking. And I created, but then was like, I wasn't sure if we were going to show it. There was like, I found an old picture of like a sketched out map of our sources of relationalities for the archive, so we can share it at some point. But it's like, Arturo's really good at mapping, right? And so we were mapping, and one of the things that we kind of found was that we had these like pre-histories of the sources of relationality, and then we had like current interlocutors, and the multidisciplinarity was kind of astounding to us, right? But when we set out to write the book, that wasn't what we ended up wanting or being able to write about in some ways, because we basically found that one of the things that we really couldn't figure out how to do but wanted to do is how you write about this thing called relationality to people stuck in a non-relational or an anti-relational life world. And the challenge of transitioning from one story of the world to the other. And what's interesting is that we realize, and I think one of the panels yesterday, I'm blanking on your name, with the different ways of knowing the tree, that was such a beautiful panel. Like, we have the access to them. Like, it's not that we don't, but we're constantly slipping back to the modern, like, product, effective, efficient, right, like, ontology. And so the book, in a sense, became more about telling, how do we tell these stories? So I think that that's where I would end. If we have time later, one of the things, we had lots of little assignments and prompts for each other as we were doing and trying to get writing, and we would get very, like, stuck and frustrated, and you know what I mean? It wasn't, like, I say I love these people, but I'm one of those people that, like, I try to really embrace the idea of, like, sometimes you need the grit to get the pearl, like we would, you know. But the one point we wrote these little essays about why we were doing this, because we were stuck in a certain sense, or not completely stuck, but Kriti made a poem out of it. And Kriti is a poet, so you probably, any poetry that's not quoted from someone else in the book is Kriti's. So I will not, it's a very long poem, so I'm not gonna read it right now. But yeah, I think that that's where I'll leave it for our collective story. And I'm gonna pass it on to Arturo, who's gonna talk about his own, and then we'll keep going from there. Thanks.
Thank you, Michal.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Thanks, Danielle, Tracy, the Design Forge team, for the invitation, for the care you've taken to prepare this symposium and this particular session on our book. That was a great introduction, Michal. Thank you. So there were two things that hadn't happened when we finished writing the book. And those two things have changed in so many ways, everything. The first one is Gaza, the genocide in Gaza. The second one was the election of Donald Trump in November of last year. Was it in November? Right. Yes. And that, compiled with so many other things, especially artificial intelligence run amok without control, without regulation, they are bound and combined with so many different ideologies, are changing everything. And we need to be prepared for that. We need to be prepared to rethink what the world is, how the world is done, and, as we said in the book, to making itself. And that, to me, those two events, and I'm taking the time to talk a little bit about this, despite the fact that we want to talk about the book as well, because I think it's so important now. That is, to me, they clearly, and to many people, spell the end of liberal secular humanism. It's like the last nail in the coffin of liberal secular humanism that lied already quite wounded, that had ceased to really illuminate how can you justify or legitimize what's been happening lately in the world in the name of any of the values of enlightenment, of Western civilization, or rationality, or science of truth, if all of those are going by the window as we talk, and a lot of destruction is settling in the world. And of course, for us, the tradition of liberal secular humanism reminds us of Sylvia Wynter and her idea that we're talking about a particular way of being human, what she called it a monohumanist mode of the human. The human as naturally individual, rational, instrumental, bourgeois, white, male, and so forth. And there are the importance of opening up the human to many other possibilities of being human that are still around, that have been in history, and many that can be invented as well. So a little bit about my trajectory, just super quickly. I have gone through many, many different disciplines. It's like epistemic errancy, I call it sometimes, beginning with chemical engineering as my undergraduate, and then nutrition, food science, and then a PhD in development studies and political economy, and then anthropology and geography, and now combination of many things. So a very interdisciplinary journey that has brought me here as well. And but three underlying questions that have been important for me. The first question is a question about social justice. I was very, very young in Cali, Colombia, where I grew up. The second is the question of difference. What is happening to difference? How are we containing difference, destroying difference? And the third one is, what are the underlying causes of this whole thing? What is driving it? Which brings me to the book again, and what Michal already mentioned, which is one of the important points of the book is for us to create our own narrative of where we have been and where we are now. And that one of the concepts that stood very clearly for us from the very beginning is what Latin American indigenous peoples have been saying for since 1992 at least, which is that the crisis today is a civilizational crisis, but it's a crisis of a particular mode of existence, Western capitalist, bourgeois, colonial, whatever way you want to characterize it. So it's a crisis in a particular mode of being and a particular mode of dwelling on the earth. And that's why it brings us back to the lens of ontology and the need for a different ontology of the human and a different way of dwelling on the earth. And the concept of narrative became very important for us as well, and one of the driving forces for it is the work of North Carolinian theologian and ecologist Thomas Berry, wonderful, wonderful work, who has in one of his books this wonderful phrase that is in the book that says something like, we are in between stories. The old story is dead, it doesn't function anymore, it has become a dysfunctional cosmology. But we have not yet learned the new story. And there are many instances of this, from Gramsci has a very famous quote on that. So the focus on narrative. And what is that narrative? It's a narrative of separation, the narrative that stems from the dualist ontology of the Western experience. From the Renaissance on, from the beginning, from patriarchy, really, all of this goes back to patriarchy, but that would be a much longer story, but certainly from at least the 17th century scientific revolution and so forth, the story of separation between mind, body, subject, object, us, them, humans, nature, and so forth, and how we shift, how we transition to a narrative of interdependence, which we argue that is a more real, a more foundational narrative for life and the human than the narrative of separation. In many ways, it's a truer narrative, and that's a statement that we can qualify, of course. And that if we accept that life is really about interdependence and not about separation, then the only possible ethical implication for praxis, for the praxis of the social, for the praxis of life, is care. Is the care and the healing of the web of life, or the web of interdependencies on which we are and depend on. Maybe finally, something quick about scale, because I think that always comes up, or the politics of relationality. What do we do with this? Why is it important politically? Isn't that romantic? Isn't it too localizing? Isn't it a losing game? Is it strong enough to confront the great evils of the moment, of the time? And that is an open question, really, for us in social theory today and in activist practice. What used to be called systemic change? How does it come about? We don't have good answers to that anymore. But one of the things that we need to move away from is the conventional narrative of scale. As the Russian doll kind of model, the global penetrates the national, penetrates the regional, penetrates the local, penetrates the household, penetrates the individual, and out of which there is no escape but to overthrow the whole thing at once, constructing an enemy, revolution as big as the enemy that we want to confront, and we know that that's a losing game. So how do we move from that kind of scale to a different way of thinking about convergences, alliances, mesh working, horizontally, connecting through affect, through similarities, through emergence, and betting on self-organization and emergence quite a bit. Okay, and I think I will stop there because my time is up. Was 8 minutes, I would say. No, that's fine. That's fine. And there is a lot to say. Maybe just say one more thing. That question of ontology again, and it is throughout the book, but it's also in an appendix, because we didn't want the more abstract discussion about ontology to be an obstacle for readers. But at the same time, is for us is very similar to cosmovision what indigenous peoples and activists call in Latin America cosmovision, a vision of the world, a vision of being, an understanding of being. And so ontologies are embedded in narratives. Narratives are embedded in infrastructures. We all see the infrastructures. Infrastructures are embedded in designs. Design are embedded in practices, which create ontologies, which create narratives, and so forth. So it's a tapestry of concepts that we find useful to think about how reality comes into being and how we can effect some change about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. You both gave me a lot to think about, and which is funny when you work with people for a long time. It's lovely to keep learning, I think, from them. I guess my sort of journey to being part of this wonderful collective and to thinking about relationality this way came from, I mean, there's a lot of starting points, but I guess I was really interested in the role of science and biology in particular in constructing certain kinds of narratives around what is possible for human beings. So I remember, just growing up, and a lot of times I have been from a young age someone who's really just been very upset, and that we live in such a stratified and brutal world in which some people have so much and others have so very little. And I think this was just, many of us have that sensibility, even as children, maybe especially as children, some sense that it doesn't quite make sense how our world is organized. And I remember just always throughout both school and the undergraduate and everything, kind of carrying that question in my heart. And often I had noticed that the sort of answers I got for why is the world this way, why is there so much stratification and brutality, it was, generally it was something like, well, that's just human nature. That's just the way things are. And, no matter what we do, it's how it's going to be. And I remember just very sincerely wondering if that was the case, not having I had some skepticism about it, but generally I was like, well, if I'm in college and, the biologists are telling me this and the ecologists are telling me this and the philosophy professor is telling me this, it must be true, on some level. But I also noticed that everyone was kind of echoing each other. So in my junior year, I had one semester where I took ecology, ethics, and economics all in the same course, or same period. And my ecology textbook was called The Economy of Nature, and it was about how, nature sort of reflects capitalist economics, essentially, how everyone is sort of making transactions, how the natural world is full of this kind of competition and stratification, et cetera. And then my economics class was always referencing ethics about why it is that it's good and right that people should be sort of stratified. And and then, of course, the economists were also sort of referencing nature and saying, well, this is not so natural. So they were all kind of talking in a circle, it felt like. But I didn't know if that's because they were all reflecting the deep structure of reality or something, or because they were sort of in an echo chamber where all these disciplines are looking to each other in order to reinforce their own beliefs, but no one knows quite where the original beliefs came from. So I never had the word ontology available to me, sort of, at that time. No one had told me what ontology meant. But I think later I realized that that's what I was kind of working with here, that an ontology as a structure is like a way of describing what is. It's saying this is how the world is. And I was sort of noticing the gaps or in that ontology, that you can't always tell the difference between the way the world is and the way the world is talked about and the way that it's narrated, right? And so I think I was noticing that there was a narration that was dominant and that I heard a lot, and that seemed sort of circular or self-reinforcing. But I wanted to know more, obviously, and kind of get deeper into this question. And so I decided to pursue biology further and to do a degree in biology, grad school, postdoc, all these things. And I think that my experience in that realm has given me a lot of, I mean, it was full of some really amazing experiences in the lab, in the field. I got to encounter all kinds of really amazing organisms and, think about like life in this sort of interesting and deep way. And I think through that, it really became clear to me that if there is a reason that the world is deeply stratified and brutal, it's not that nature said that. Like, nature didn't say that. Nature did not make it so. It was people who've told me this kind of all throughout. And sort of the reference to nature and to the way things are continually to justify our current conditions is an old habit, I would say. It's sort of sometimes a move for political power. It's one that's evoked not just by, it's usually kind of associated nowadays with like eugenics, or the notion that some people are intrinsically superior, which is sort of associated with conservatism. And that is absolutely having a resurgence. There's no doubt. There's actually a lot of people who really, really want to prove that there is, intrinsic superiority in nature, and that certain, not only, it's so many different steps. It's like, not only are some people superior to others, but also that gives the right to rule. And so these questions come down to these questions of governance. Who has the right to rule, and by what right? Who rules and by what right? That question is very up in the air right now. And it's been for a long time. It's not just a conservative position, though. It's been a liberal position for a long time. And that's sort of what we talk about in the book, is the secular liberal humanism, not just in the sense of like, liberal in the way we usually hear it as like opposed to conservatives, but a long tradition, the classical liberal tradition of thinking about people as sort of, having individual rights, being individual, and that certain people have the right to rule due to their merit, essentially. Like, if it's not an intrinsic quality, it's because some people just got ahead in the game of life. And so that's kind of the notion of meritocracy. And I think part of some of the stakes of relationality, really, and the politics of relationality, that's why I'm sort of talking explicitly about politics right now, are that there is no, that there seems to be this real desire to ask nature, or to ask like one very strong man, or to ask really, really smart people, or whoever it is that we're looking to, in order to tell us what to do and how to be. And actually, that's been a lot of giving up on the notion that people collectively are capable of creating our worlds together, designing them together, and governing them together in common. That idea has been under attack for a long time, especially as a reaction to the Cold War. And I think in this work in relationality, especially in this moment, I hope what comes through in part is, again, really the taking responsibility for designing our lives, our narratives, our world, and our collective future, that it is really going to be up to us. No one is coming to save us from the deep crises that we are in, and putting our faith in those structures has really undermined our faith in each other. So I hope that the book and especially in this moment, that it gives us some courage and inspiration in that direction. I think that's my talk. Great. Excellent.
Thanks, Kriti. Thank you to all three of you for sharing. You want to say something else? Go ahead.
Sorry,
No,
we were
okay.
like, I was doing the collective, and I will be brief. I'll try to be brief. It's not really my forte. So I was trying to think of, so my story, I guess I did share a little bit of it as it intersects with the collective, but one of the things that I still remember, I don't know if you remember this, Arturo, it was like my first or second year of grad school, and I was this like activist, right? I was like gonna change. I was like part of the anti-capitalist movement, and the global justice movement was happening, and I was starting to do research on it, but I was like doing it because I was part of it, And you asked me to read Stephen Johnson's book, Emergent, which we love Adrienne Brown, but he actually, people were writing about this, and Krishnamurti. the same summer. And I was like, and I was a very like not into spirituality person. And I had grown up thinking religion was a very toxic thing, actually. And there was something that happened as I finished my dissertation and also finished my research with this specifically autonomous anti-capitalist wing of the ultra-globalization movement in Italy, but I had also spent time in Chiapas and with this thing called the global justice, or the ultra-globalization movement is how I prefer to think of it. And I had been both inspired and heartbroken by what I witnessed, right? I had been so inspired by the vision and the story and the other worlds that they had painted, and then heartbroken by this was when I was finishing, there was like other bad elections, but also by like the inability of the movements to actually live their talk, right? And I was like really puzzled and intrigued by the gap between theory and practice. And as I came, and then so that was happening on my intellectual life. I'd finished my dissertation, which was also I'm not gonna cuss, but it was a big disaster. I did pass, but oh my God. No. But then I also had like a lot of personal, just like I kind of came to a place in myself. Like I think I had what at the time I didn't realize was like a form of depression. And it was a depression of like the limits of what I thought was possible, but it was also in terms of what was my greater frame of meaning. And I was so privileged at that time to be a teaching faculty for this program, and we got to go all over the world. And I was in New Zealand for part of it, and I remember having this conversation with this elder from the Maori community in their longhouse, and she goes, so she says hi to me, and where are you from? And I started telling her my story, because I was born in Israel to a person from a displaced persons camp, from a refugee that was exiled from Uruguay, from all these things. And I had always thought my like multiculturalism was like this big asset. And she started crying. And as she cried, I felt my grief at my placelessness, at my uprootedness, and at the uprootedness of so many of my ancestors not by their choice, right? And I just came up against this like wall of grief and pain that hadn't been felt. And there was a certain liberation that I came to. And I also, in that same trip, like was taken to their sacred mountain and their sacred lake and like saw things and felt things that I could not rationally or politically explain. And it was one of the most humbling and beautiful, life-changing moments of my life. And I had practiced yoga, but I hadn't practiced yoga, right? Like I was like doing it to get like stretching and breathing. But so I would say that one of the other things that when I got back, there was this really beautiful network of activists that had started doing what people call deep change or spiritual activism or healing justice. And I encountered them at the US Social Forum, first in Atlanta, which it was just Emergent in, but then really in Detroit in 2010. And I just was at a workshop where people started talking about our nervous systems. And that just like really hit home. Because as we start to observe our default settings in our own nervous systems, am I a fight, flight, freeze, fawn combination person, right? Like I started realizing the patterns in our movements and in our systems, and like, could we slow down enough to be with all of it, right? Like to be with our nervous systems as they were, so that, and the remarkable thing, right, about practicing, whether it's through trauma work or through contemplative practice, is when you take the time to sit and be with it all, something else becomes possible, even though it's not like, you know what I mean? It's not like goal-oriented, but it does something, right? And that really, really, really gave me an experiential understanding of this thing that Arturo was like bringing in as like an intellectual relationality, which it took me years to really understand what that word was doing for me. And now it's like, it means so much even more to me since beginning. But one of the things that there is a quote in the book that is so foundational, and it comes from Martin Luther King Jr., but it wasn't foundational as in we started there. It's like, and this is what I found the book aimed to do, or did for me, was like putting into words things that you already felt and knew, but like, at least that's what we tried. So he says, I cannot be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. That is the interrelated structure of reality. And that is a really hard statement if you think about it, right? Like my liberation is actually bound up in your liberation. Like, and liberation isn't just freedom from these systems, it's freedom from these internalized thought patterns and internalized ways of thinking that I am separate or greater than or lesser than, right? And so the journey for me has been like foundational, and it really has given me a new lease on how I want to work and be in the world. I'm not really following any notes right now, so I'm just gonna wrap up. But I think that one of the things I really wanted to name, that one of the things that gives me a lot of hope, but is sort of counterintuitive when we think about words like ontology and epistemology, and like our book is like, I kind of wanted to make a joke, but I ran out of steam, like make little like cards that have these really challenging words and then like try to define them simply. Because what we are trying to do is give us new vocabulary to restory our lives, right? And I think part of, there's a quote from a children's book that I actually found in my, like, I don't even know where it came from, but I was reading it to my daughter and I was like, oh my God, this is what we're trying to say. It's like, what is this story doing to you? It's not about like whether it's true or provable, right? It's like, what does it do to you, right? And I think that one of the ways we change and make worlds is by letting go of this need constantly to like be right? Like there's like, ontology sometimes sounds so serious, right? But we can create together. We can make things through practicing different ways of being, right? So when we start a lecture by getting into our bodies, right? Or when we interrupt a negative thought pattern. I don't know how many of you actually in this room read the book, but one of the things that we really wanted everyone to be is like recognize themselves as a really loved and like worthy person. Because so much of scarcity exists not just because we're like taught that there's scarcity in the world, but like our egoic systems are programmed to want to be better than, but that's also premised an idea that someone is worse than, instead of just us all, I did that on purpose, being, you know, both beautiful and awful and gorgeous and capable of doing some really awful or, you know, messed up things. So that was a very wandering part of my talk. Thanks.
Thank you to each of you for sharing your, not only your personal experiences, but your collective experiences and how you came to authoring this book. I do want to take just a moment and speak to our virtual attendees. We would love to hear from you in our Q&A session, so be thinking about questions that you would like to have asked in our open Q&A session, and just go ahead and place those in the chat, and then we'll have a representative share those in just a little bit. In the meantime, some of you may know that we had a 4-session book club, and our book club participants prepared some questions for our panelists, and so we're going to start with those. So the first question to you all is about framing the journey. You've already done some of this for us already, but this specific question is, this book invites readers into a deep rethinking of fundamental human relationships. Who did you imagine as the audience for this work, and what kinds of conversations do you hope that it sparks?
Thank you. I always thought, and I did mention this, I remember, to Arturo and Michal, when I wrote my first book, Interdependence, a friend of mine, Emily Chavez, said, you should imagine a really kind reader. Like, imagine someone who just really is out there and they want to hear what you have to say, and they're interested. They might not understand everything, but they're generous, they're patient, and they are, you know, have a good will, basically. And that really influenced, I think, the writing, because one can, if you imagine an argumentative reader, then the writing becomes sort of fussy, and you know, you're arguing against someone, which that's not bad. It, like, sometimes we do need to kind of have a more confrontational style. I think this was imagining, first of all, knowing that if we were feeling that there was something missing based on our journeys, you know, sometimes something missing in activist communities or social movements, something missing in social theory, something missing, and so in science, certainly, then we couldn't be the only ones. So trying to imagine that there are people who know that there's something that is not quite right in the world and in a lot of these systems that we are caught up in. Not only that, our collectives to try to change those systems also are fraught with a lot of conflict and a lot of difficulty. And so, yeah, imagining people who were really wanted things to change but didn't quite know how, which was sort of similar to how we are. So in that sense, we even say this, that the book is a basket of noticings, it is a wondering aloud, it's not prescriptive, it's meant to be opening a conversation and bringing up questions that we ourselves were really invested in.
Okay, I'll say a little bit about to what extent this book for me is also for designers in a moment. But I want to start by saying that in retrospect, maybe I didn't feel it that way, or maybe it was that way before when we were writing. This book was like a scream and a warning and an invitation for anybody who cared to listen. Of course, mostly is for academics, students, activists, about what's going on in the world today, about the residuo, and that's the concept that we develop out of concept being proposed and conceptualized mostly by indigenous women in South America, particularly Mapuche women. And Moira Millán, you'll find her in the book. Her book on Terricide is coming out in English. It came out in Spanish, it's coming out in French, in Portuguese. So please do take a look at that book. And scream to the academy, because I think the academy, we all three share that we see the academy as very complicit, taken as a whole. There's a lot of great people in the academy and doing great things, but taken as a whole, the academy has become, it's always been, but even more so now, part of the forces of occupation, part of the forces of ontological occupation, I would say, of people's lives and experiences. We need to develop that. But to speak about to what extent this is, for me in particular, was about for designers as well. By designers, first of all, understood, and maybe I'll mention Clive Dilnot. Some of you might know who he is. He's at the New School, at Parsons School, emeritus professor, the editor of the series in which this book just came out. The series is called Beyond the Modern. Kept insisting to us to say it's not design, it's designing, always a process, always an open-ended project, an open-ended process. We have to move from design that is too objectifying, too instrumental. And Ezio Mancini, who's also been important to us in this journey, writes this book called Design When Everybody Designs. So everybody's a designer. We're all designers of our own lives. The world is designed. It can be designed otherwise. So in that sense, that book is also for design audiences, professional designers who are trying, like in this Design Forge conference, I saw a lot of that, trying to shift the practice to a practice that acknowledges, ontologically reorients design towards interdependence and care.
Thank you for that. So our next question is about living with complexity, which all three of you have mentioned to some degree already, and so we want to expand a little bit on that. One of the most compelling tensions in the book is the challenge of holding multiple frames at once, recognizing the realities of extractive and oppressive systems while striving for more relational ways of being. How do you approach sitting with these contradictions, and what practices help navigate this cognitive dissonance? What a loaded question.
So I don't think I actually mentioned it. So one of the things that we discovered along the way of holding the politics of theory and politics of relationality working group, where we reconvened this little trio, was that we each of us had started practice, contemplative practice. And there was actually a moment early on where Kriti had announced to us that she was even thinking of going into, into a monastery. And we all were really inspired by Buddhism in particular, but not only. And I'm the more super collective person in this bunch, but I remember one time we were at a talk, so we would get a little bit of pushback on the sort of woo-woo side of things. But I remember being why is it that there's always like a spiritual dimension to the authors. Like we didn't choose it that way. It just sort of like started being present there. So I think that in this question is one of the answers, right? Like we sat with, like that is what is at the heart of all contemplative traditions, whether it's Buddhism or contemplative Christianity or Islam or, right? Like there's a contemplative tradition in all of these. And one of the things that they teach us, the contemplative mind, is a non-dualist mind. That's what you learn when you sit for long enough, right? Like you accept things as they are. And in that place, paradox and contradiction doesn't really get to us the way that it does when we're trying to resolve things conceptually, right? Like we all live with so much paradox and contradiction, right? We are contradictory beings. That is life. Life is a contradictory, paradoxical thing, like our behavior, right? Like we can want this really great thing and then act like a jerk because some weird sabotage, I don't know. Like we're very paradoxical creatures, and that is part of what we were trying to like accept. And that is what I think is one of the things that's part of non-dualism or relationality. And I think it sounds really like light when I say it this way, but I think that part of the power of it is that it asks our Western goal-oriented, right answer-oriented minds to take a back seat. And one of the things that, like I said, emerged for me, but I think they probably already knew this and like intuitively, is that in a lot of the spiritual traditions, the mind is supposed to become subservient to the heart. The heart is also is also an organ of perception and of cognition, right? It's just a different kind of cognition. And the West has elevated rationalism, but there are other ways of knowing. And actually, we probably can think, we could sit here and invite ourselves to do a practice of like thinking about those moments in our own lives. So I will leave it there. I mean, there's so much more I could say, but I'll leave it for y'all to, if you want to add anything. No?
Okay. Thank you, Michal. The last question I want to share from the book club participants is talking about engaging across perspectives. You talked about the interdisciplinary aspect to this work, and so your work speaks to those already invested somewhat in these ideas, but also invites engagement with people who may not share your ontological perspectives. When faced with the question, why does this matter, from those deeply embedded in other ways of thinking, perhaps even well-intentioned ways of thinking, how have you responded while remaining true to your ethical and political commitments?
There were a few concepts that we found particularly useful. There were kind of revelations here and there, and you'll find them throughout the book. I'm not talking about ontology, although that was important as well, but slippages, portals, bridges, toxic loops, healing loops, relationality, obviously, and hybrid. Somewhere we say, who do we write for? So we write for the hybrids. And the hybrids is everybody, to a greater or lesser extent. Well, we could think about exceptions, but especially now in Donald Trump era. But the hybrids that are in between the stories of separation and the story of relationality, between the story of sort of die-hard individualism, instrumentalism, and control, patriarchal accelerationism of patriarchal ways of being and so forth, and those who are being waken up and shaken up by the state of things, and who are aiming to, and maybe have been for a long time, and have always been there, the hybrids have always been there, to shift to a different story of life, to a different way of being. So the book is literally for everybody, because if we adopt a position of profound relationality, actually, you have to really abandon the idea of an enemy, of fighting against an enemy. There is no enemy, because the enemies are us, from the get-go, and for many people, from the beginning of the universe. I mean, it's interdependence on a law, it's interdependence all the way down, so to speak. David Bohm, the quantum physicist, has this wonderful concept that says, he calls about the unbroken wholeness of the universe. And it's that sort of garment of destiny that is cosmic, and it's the earth. So we inhabit a living earth and a living cosmos, and we are all woven together in this garment. So, and finally, I'll say this inviting people to be mindful of how we go around these toxic loops of existence, but also how we are continuously also aiming, even in our small individual life or family life, to shift to a different way, a more relational way, where that acknowledges interdependence, and that today it begins to be maybe deeply concerned in a new manner about what's going on in the world.
Yeah, I think I agreed with a lot of what Arturo said, and so I don't have a ton to add. I just would say that I guess a little bit more about kind of what I was referencing earlier, this question of who do we think is in charge here, and who is actually going to bring about a livable future. And so I think there is something, when I'm asked, like, why does this matter, especially things that have to do with like ontology or reality, things that seem to be like really philosophical questions, that often then it's like, well, that's a nice philosophical question, but you have to kind of still get up and go to work, etc. And I think there's been a lot of terrible things that have been happening, and one of the silver linings of that is that I think the three of us are people who have been kind of clear for decades that there is a very kind of profound crisis of politics, meaning, climate, obviously, that we're embedded in. But we, keep finding more and more people who are convinced of the same, specifically because we see a real fragmentation, and so the silver lining there is perhaps more openness to the concept that things are not working, and therefore the changes that we need are profound. And I think that's kind of where this question of, what is the world like? Who do we think we are? What do we think our constraints are? What do we think is possible for the world? Those are really, really important questions, because if we don't take them capaciously, then we've really limited our imaginations. And I think that is part of how we are in our situation, is the sort of ordinary work of thinking, oh, I'm just going to live like, it's not that we don't all live ordinary lives in our ordinary days. I do, certainly. But that it's one thing to just do that, and it's another thing to think that the world could not be otherwise, and to really think that there is kind of no hope, no future beyond what's really immediately pragmatic, and that to kind of stick with what seems like it's just immediately pragmatic is the death of everything we love. It is, in the sense that it's not like the climate crisis is going away, eventually. And so I think that the stakes are high, and we hope that no one book can do, obviously it's like no one person, no one book can like kind of bring about huge changes or live up to its promises in that way. Or we didn't even promise that the book would change the world. It was just sort of like, we never have. And so, within reason, we just hope in sort of a modest way that at least it can bring to the fore questions that are kind of deeper and perhaps even on longer timescales than the sort of immediately politically pragmatic.
And I'll just add one thing. I think that part of what's interesting about the plane that we talk about as ontological, and this is, I think, something that, when Arturo talks about a politics without an enemy that he brought up a moment ago, like that is a hard one to really take in. And one of the like premises of non-dualism, right, is like good and bad are not what we're talking about. We're talking about reality. We're talking about the nature of reality. And so the differences in sharing our ontological perspective is different than having a political disagreement. And I think that that's actually like, that can become an opening, right? Because if we start talking about the nature of the real, then you might find, I actually have found that people that don't necessarily agree with me ideologically, I can meet them in ways because we can connect on what it means to be human and what it means to be loving and what it means to be kind. And it's interesting because, again, one of the things I've started to think more about is like practice and how are you rather than what do you believe and think and say, because words can sound really good, but how are you as a neighbor, right? Like, how are you as a caretaker to the garden, to the earth, right? Like, there's a difference. And I think that sometimes one of the things that I actually like found in my research, but also I think as we've been having these discussions is like, one of the biggest pushbacks I think Arturo and I have gotten in the University of North Carolina people, but maybe I'm wrong, but is this idea of bringing in, so chapter 2 is talking about modern social theory, and we really bring in the problem of the secular. And people have problematized the secular, but it's one thing to like intellectually problematize the secular and then actually be with what it means to say like, there was a spirit, my ancestor helped me write this, right? Like, there is a difference, and I think that people that can understand that aren't the ones you expect to be the ones that are on your side necessarily, and I think that helps with some of what you're asking, right? Like, there's these interesting ways in which we can connect on that plane. At least that's been my experience, and maybe it's my hope. But I will also say it's also been challenging because people that I think are on my side have such a negative view of what humans are, or have such a like angry version of the enemy, that my heart starts to close. And that's one of the things that I've become more sensitive to that recently. And so it's harder for me to be in traditional political spaces lately.
Thank you for sharing that vulnerable response and being transparent in that. I do want to take just a moment and turn to our virtual co-host, Tyson and Mackenzie, to see if we have any questions from our virtual attendees.
Yes, we do. Thank you so much. One thought from our online participants is, do you mind sharing your thoughts on the need to respond to AI, artificial intelligence discourse?
We all know.
Well, this could be such a long conversation. I'm not an expert on AI, but I've been trying to follow it to the extent that I can. And there are many critiques of AI in the academy. Some of them are very interesting philosophically. Many of them are traced back to Heidegger's critique of technology and why artificial intelligence can never really be the same as human intelligence. But I think what is most important for me is that AI is transforming every single domain of life. As we know it, everywhere we look, it is there. And there is no conversation in the public. I mean, the conversation in the public seems to be so limited. At least the sort of the 6 o'clock news rendition of it is the question the journalists always ask an expert is, how can we maximize the benefits of AI while minimizing the risks? And that's a very shallow way of putting the conversation. We have to go much deeper. We have to think how it is transforming the human, it's transforming society, how is transforming labor, how is going to cause massive unemployment, how is transforming wars. Everything is being transformed, and it's being transformed in a way that is deeply problematic. It's deeply patriarchal to begin with, in the sense that patriarchy is an ontology that privileges, control, hierarchy, appropriation, domination, and eventually violence and war. It is often deeply racist as well. I mean, there's a lot of algorithms of oppression. It's a great book by Safiya Noble, African-American scholar, that everybody should read, how these algorithms that rule our lives are embedded with the structures of racism and oppression and colonialism. So it is deeply capitalist as well. I really like the book by Yanis Varoufakis, Yanis Varoufakis is a former Greek finance minister. You find them all over the internet now. His book is called Techno-Feudalism, What Killed Capitalism. And he argues that we're not in capitalism anymore, we're in a techno-feudalist mode or age in which we are all serfs to, as Bernie Sanders would put it, to the techno-billionaires, the oligarchs who are now increasingly ruling the world, not just the US, but increasingly ruling the world. So there will be much more to say about that, but I just leave it at that for now. But it's a very worrisome trend. We are all so enmeshed in it. Is pervading our lives, and we need to pause and observe and build collective conversations around what is going on with AI.
Thank you for that, Arturo. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
Yes. Thank you so much. We do have another question from our online participants. So this question comes from Antonio. Can you speak more to the role of care in any conversations on relationality?
Let me just say one quick thing about that. Since I keep working on care, I think it's such an important concept, but it has a long genealogy in feminist theory, feminist economics in particular, but also in feminist philosophy, but also in indigenous philosophies. Indigenous philosophies are very much about care as well. And I would say that care for me is emerging as a language that can convene lots of people. Care is not about an enemy to begin with. We all together have to care for the web of life, for the healing of the web of life, because we are that, we are the web of life. So there are many philosophical now trends to rethink care by activists and by academics as well, and playing around with the concept that a Colombian feminist activist is being introducing, which is a revolution of care. And to the revolution of AI and the new kind of techno-feudal capitalism based in the cloud, we can oppose the revolution of care.
We could probably say more on care. I'm curious if there are other questions, just so we don't run out of. I don't mean to be an facilitator, I just wanted to know. We could just keep going.
That was actually where we were going next, a perfect transition of if there's any questions from the audience, we'd love to hear those from you. If you don't mind just stepping to the mic so everyone can hear.
While people think, let me flag a book for you that just came up, it would be very pertinent to this conversation. It's a book by a great group in Boston called Design Studio for Social Intervention, DS4SI, which is headed by a wonderful African-American designer, Kenny Bailey. The book is called Ideas, Arrangements, Effects. And it's a very hands-on friendly book about how we can download the big isms, capitalism, racism, colonialism, heteropatriarchalism, into particular arrangements in everyday life. How can we get to see them operating there, and then what the effects are and how we can shift things around.
Hi. Am I on mic? Yeah, okay. So I guess my question, maybe it's not so much, it's not as well formed, I'm sorry. I was flustered by getting up. Really had to go back to what you were talking about in terms of like care, but like relating that also to like spirituality. And I hate to like sum it up that way, but it seems that like in this demise of, I think you said, secular, liberal humanism is dying. This idea of like who we were accountable to seems to be really the question that I have as we look at sort of like the role of spirituality and even separating that from religion to like the role of like being secular in this individualism, like this idea of separation. And the accountability to me means that like there's something higher that we're accountable to, whether or not it's ourselves or our parents or a religious figure or a higher power, but even like at the very pragmatic part of it, it's like, are we like just accountable to each other, accountable to the planet, and accountable to cultures or traditions? And it seems that a lot of people are not trusting that people are holding care for them. And so therefore they are, in order to protect their traditions and their cultures, this idea of protectionism, are seeing everyone else as the enemy. And there's like there's a lack of trust there that sort of leads to an assumption that people don't care. And so therefore, if you can't trust people to care for you, then how can you really relate to them? And I guess post-COVID, I see that people are holding up into their own little bubbles. Like we were literally bubbled and they're separating more. So how do we like burst some of these bubbles so we can learn to trust each other again? I guess is my question, so that I can trust that you might care for the same things that I care for, which might be harmony and family and being able to have a backyard barbecue and hang out and do a nature walk with my family. Like, I don't trust that you hold those things in value. So therefore, it's like, not that I see you as an enemy, but I see you as like, I don't know, I guess the unknowing and not trusting. So I guess what I'm saying is empathy is really hard right now. So how do we get back to a point where we can even start to understand each other?
I think that was such a gorgeous question. I think you answered a lot of it. So I think part of it is like, what are the practices that allow our hearts to feel at home enough here that we can take down the right armor? And I think, and please interrupt me because I could go off forever on this. I think that actually, honestly, just starting to crowdsource practices and experiences is a good way to do that. And I think part of what we also have to realize is that Rebecca Solnit has this beautiful book called A Paradise Built in Hell that describes all these natural disasters that have happened in the history of the United States, and how the tendency for humans is not the one we think. The tendency for humans is not to hoard and call the police and amass weapons. That's the tendency for the people in power, but the people on the ground that have lost everything help and care for each other. That is just human nature. Right? And so what has gotten in our way? And so I think part of what we also, another crucial revelation in the book was the active construction of non-relationality, the active storying of a world in which you have to be afraid of your neighbors, right? You have to be afraid of the other. You have to be afraid that, they don't actually care about you. I mean, that's what I feel and hear everywhere. And that's, I think, so countering that with stories, experiences of the opposite, because we all have them and they are so real and common. And so I think, I did start us with grief, but I also want to say that we do need stories of joy and right, and we need to make conviviality possible. And I think that's one of the things that one of the problems with our political culture sometimes is that we're so committed to the work and focusing on the problem and the oppression that our hearts, that's where they live. And they actually need the experiential felt sense of ease and care. Because if you don't have that as a somatic experiential memory, it's hard to build a world where that is the premise, right? And so when we, practice is so key to all of this. And the other thing I just want to say is whether we want it or not, we are in a period of tremendous crisis. And I don't wish it this way, but a lot of people are going to suffer. Right? There's economic crisis, there's climate crisis, there's, our students are being taken off the streets right now. But what happens in moments of crisis is that we are faced with our human, the greatness of who we are, I really believe. And so I think, and that's why I think the stories that we tell, people, could say we're romanticizing non-wealthy or non-Western, but part of it is because it's when I was just teaching this book yesterday in class, Jesus and the Disinherited, which is by Howard Thurman, who was a mystic teacher in the civil rights movement. He was MLK's teacher, but he talks about people with their back up against the wall. That's who Jesus was, and that's how he learned to love his enemy, because he had to. We don't do this out of choice in the way that we would like the heroic story to go, right? So when our backs up are against the wall, what muscle memory, you know what I mean? What heart muscle memory do I have that's I'm gonna be vulnerable rather than hoard, right? I'm gonna help my neighbor rather than, and I think you're right that it's hard work, but I think as more and more of us experience, because it is getting generalized. I mean, like, I wouldn't have wanted it this way, but so many of us are now experiencing unemployment even before AI did it to us, right? Like, there's all these weird pockets of people, and I don't want to make it like that this was a good thing, but there are silver linings to being in positions where we actually need to be reminded that we need each other, right? Because one of the things that capitalism has made possible is this ridiculous myth that we're individuals. And we never were, and we never are, but the myth has been made possible by this like weird system. And so as it falls apart, there's the possibility of, cultivating and remembering. Again, it is something innate to us, I truly believe, and that's, maybe I'm a romantic.
I think, yeah, I agree with what Michal said, and I really appreciate the question. Thank you. I think what my friend and colleague Maddie Bryce used the metaphor of like a perfume bottle that it's called an atomizer, right? So a perfume bottle, and you press this little bulb, and then the perfume goes out, right? And so she said, that was such a nice analogy. I wish we had it before writing the book so we could have put it in there, but that atomization then, right, is taking something that's like a liquid, that's all, and then it's poofing it into tiny pieces, right? And so that is actually a process, and that's sort of what that's what Michal just said, that's what we were trying to talk about in the book, to show that it is a process that is ongoing and that has been going on for a long time. That atomization is something that, to give one example, like, why is private property such a big thing, and why do we all have our own little houses that most of us can't afford, actually, right? Like our generation and the next generation, like, I don't know how people are gonna afford houses, it's real, right? And so it is and it's partly, that there's such a concerted effort to basically to make public housing could exist in like a really big, large-scale way, and it doesn't, in part because there was like a real movement, a neoliberal movement to make sure that we would be housed privately. And same with sort of, if we look at the history of land use in the country, that with the indigenous people of this lands, there was real economic incentives that were given to indigenous people to sell off collectively owned land in order to parcel it out, and particular private parcels in a way that was going against what the actual lifeway was, and that was based on blood, that was sort of based on the concept of race. And so it's like, these are processes by which we became so separate, and I think remembering that in this moment is actually good, because it sort of makes us realize that if it takes so much work to keep those systems going, we can, it's a moment to think about how we want to do things differently, and how we could, as my friend Maddie says, like, go back from being atomized and come to like some kind of liquid state in a way. So yeah, those are some things I'd say.
I want to be brief. I know we're running out of time, but one thing I wanted to focus on with all of the insights here was that the book cared for me. So you did a brilliant job in reading, and it's slow, and it's emergent, and it's connected, and it's de-disciplined. And it is our separation from one another and our segmentation of everything, as you were just speaking to, that is so problematic. And how do we recall and reintegrate? How do we write differently? How do we visualize differently? So I'm so grateful for that. And your point here about storying and sharing strategies, stories and strategies, right? And I'm honored, since I came here, to be a part of an initiative to uncover hidden histories together, to co-create those histories together, now with youth and with elders, to share those stories and literally remake place, to put them into our parks, to put them into our homes and our libraries, and to bring them to the schools. And you were also mentioning that it's not the outcome, we must live for the process. And I was finding that it was bringing joy and connection as a way to live the pain outside of it. So I'm just so thankful for what you're doing. And I could ask more questions, but I know we're running out of time. So I want to say thank you, and I'm so eager for allowing this work to continue to flourish. Thank you.
it's so special to have a book cared for, like to have heard that there was a book club. Like it was just so cool, and I got the privilege of attending one session, and it was just such a neat, thoughtful, lovely group of people from different walks of life, different disciplines, and it was a really moving experience. Because I mean, for me, the other thing about books and it's like, what I didn't want is for it to be an academic book that got, like only talked about by, like it's supposed to be useful and also argued over. Like you can I'd rather it be disagreed with and do something than like just sit over somewhere. So thank you for the care, and like just to see that space and to like get a glimpse of your world. It's such a beautiful way that you work and that you call people together and you gather us. So I think gatherings are such an important practice right now. So thank you.
I want to echo the thank yous. I also want to thank our virtual attendees and our virtual co-hosts, as well as our in-person attendees, and a special thank you to our panelists. So please join me in thanking them one more time. Before we officially close, I have just a couple of announcements for you. The first is that feedback is really important, not only for this session, but also for the Design Forge in general. And so you will be receiving an email from Danielle and her team with feedback. And if you complete that feedback survey, you will be entered to receive a signed copy of the book that our author so kindly just signed for us. The other thing is, if you do have your own copy of the book and you would like to get it signed today, they are going to stay here and you can do that. And then lastly is that we are going to have a tour of Elon if anyone is interested in doing that. And Bonnie Buckley, Bonnie, wave your hand. Yes, this is Bonnie. She is going to meet us right outside if you want to partake in that tour at Elon. So, Danielle, do you have anything else you want to say? Okay, thank you all for attending Design Forge and for this session, and thank you again to our panelists.